Offences that once drew a slap on the wrist now attract fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
A slap on the wrist refers to a form of punishment more metaphysical than real, where the person who did the wrong thing, they slap the person on the wrist, and that's supposed to be their punishment for the crime. This is used to describe crimes where somebody committed a pretty serious crime, and then for some reason maybe they are friends with the judge, or they're rich, or whatever the case may be. They're treated very leniently by the court. So rather than go to jail for, let's say, a couple years, they only have to do community service for a couple of months or a couple of weeks or a few days, and then they get their record reduced or eliminated, and that's known as a slap on the wrist. Oftentimes teenagers will commit crimes that if they committed the crimes when they were adults, they would end up going to jail for, maybe even years and years. But since they're under 18, if it's a first offense, typically they'll get a slap on the wrist and told not to do it again, and hopefully learn their lesson and go on to be honest, productive adults. I was driving my car the other day, and I went just a few miles an hour over the speed limit. I was going like 68 in a 65 mile an hour zone, and I got stopped and I got a ticket, and I have to go to court, and I'm hoping that either the police won't show up to testify against me, or if I am found guilty, that it'll just be a slap on the wrist and I won't get a serious charge because it was just a few miles an hour over the speed limit.
Offences that once drew a slap on the wrist now attract fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as prison terms for palm greasing managers.
Palm greasing comes from the expression to grease someone's palm, where the grease refers to money, and where the palm is obviously the hand. So it means to bribe someone, to get them to do what you want them to do, to grease the wheels, so to speak, to get a positive outcome in your favor. So, for example, in some cities, probably even today, it's a very common practice for landowners or apartment or building owners to grease the palms of building inspectors. Because if they don't grease their palms, then the assumption is that the building inspector will find something wrong with the building, and then the building owner will have to do expensive repairs, even if there's nothing really wrong, or if the wrong thing is really something very, very mild. Okay, similarly, in a lot of places in the country, up until fairly recently, it was common practice for people who were caught speeding to hand over their license to the police officer with a $20 bill underneath the license. And like they didn't even know the $20 bill was there. And then the police officer was supposed to just take the $20 bill and give them back their license and tell them to go on their way. But more recently, there's been a pretty large crackdown on that, and as far as I know, it's not that common anymore. There's this new restaurant in town that everybody wants to go to, and it's very, very difficult to get reservations for the restaurant, and almost impossible to get a walk-in. So I went there with my girlfriend the other day, said hello to the maitre d', and I greased his palm with a $100 bill, and you wouldn't believe it, but we got a table right away. For the recent Olympics in Russia, There were some very large delays in building the Olympic facilities, which was going to be a huge embarrassment for Putin. So he ordered his people to just start greasing palms to get them to get to work and finally get everything ready, which they did. And some people say that they had to grease these people for billions of dollars to get them to go to work.
But the cost and complexity of investigations are spiraling beyond what is reasonable, fed by a ravenous compliance industry of lawyers and forensic accountants.
Ravenous refers to being very hungry, which could be for real food. I could say I feel very ravenous, so I'm going to eat a large meal. It can also refer to being very hungry in the sense of being very greedy, or to want some type of satisfaction of some type, typically of some illicit or immoral nature. And it can also refer to just a general business style. For example, you could say that lawyers tend to be very ravenous, or accountants or executives, meaning that they're very motivated by getting money and they don't particularly care if they're doing it honestly. So most people, even if they're very hungry, maybe if they haven't eaten for a couple days, but most people would not describe themselves as being ravenous, at least not for real. They might say it ironically and just mean that they're hungry, they're looking forward to a big meal. A lot of times nowadays, what may seem like fairly unimportant lawsuits end up being a lot more important than you might imagine because of very ravenous attorneys, where they ask for very high amounts of damages well beyond what people think would be reasonable. In today's society, a lot of people are very inclined to sue other people, and one of the results is that there's some very ravenous attorneys who are inclined to go after people for very, very high damages for relatively minor offenses. One of the difficult issues with keeping lions for pets, besides the risk of getting eaten, is that lions have very ravenous appetites, and so it's necessary to feed them huge quantities of meat on a daily basis so that they eat the meat instead of eating you.
That's all for today. Tom Taylor is an ESL tutor. He teaches English in the United States and outside, all over the world, using Skype. He can be reached at his website, which is
ESL-fullsteamahead.com.
Click on this link and check out his website and email with questions. Thank you, Tom, and I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.